Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we've got a couple of things to discuss, including a signing over in Toronto, a couple of PTO updates, a couple of retirements from around the NHL, plus a couple of trade rumors involving the Dallas Stars, the Columbus Blue Jackets, Edmonton Oilers, and then a possible trade between the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Anaheim Ducks. So I'll go to all of that coming up right now. Hello everyone, welcome back to another video here at the Internet Talker Show. Now, as usual, I'm going to kick things off today by discussing a couple of signings that have happened from around the NHL. Today, only got one signing to talk about. Has been a really busy week of signings over the past couple of days. But that was a pretty significant signing, with one of the bigger remaining UFAs left in the free agent market. And that's that the Toronto Maple Leafs has signed 7th, 8th defenseman Simon Benoit to a one-year deal with an AAV of $775,000, and the deal will begin at the start of this upcoming season. So for Benoit, he was last year a part of the Anaheim Ducks organization. The past couple of years he has been with the Anaheim Ducks. He's been really good as like a 6th, 7th defenseman in Anaheim. He got into a ton of games over the past couple of years. 2 years ago, put up a goal and 4 assists, 5 points in 53 games. This past year, 3 goals, 7 assists, 10 points in 78 games. So he's not going to give you a ton of NHL points, but he's a really good physical type of player. He can block shots. He can lay some big hits. I'm pretty sure he was one of the Ducks' leaders in hits last year, so he's definitely a really good physical player. Playing on like a third pair role, he would be a fantastic addition to any sort of team. So I think with the Toronto Maple Leafs, with the lack of physicality on that roster, I think adding a guy like Benoit would be perfect. Now, I'm not sure if he's going to make the NHL roster. They do have a couple of guys who I think could go on waivers. I think Connor Timmins is a perfect guy, candidate to go on waivers. If Timmins goes on waivers, I could easily see Benoit possibly being like a 7th defenseman for the Maple Leafs. So it's going to be interesting to see. I know the Maple Leafs are in a tight cap situation, and it's quite possible we could see Benoit be placed on waivers himself and be sent to the minors if he clears. So it's going to be interesting to see, but I think this is a really good sign for the Leafs. If they run into injuries, he can do really well, show really good stuff out of training camp, maybe he makes the team. He should be a really good 6th, 7th defenseman, maybe 7th, 8th defenseman. I think he'll definitely be a solid third pair defenseman if called upon. And I think that's a really good signing for the Toronto Maple Leafs. So Benoit's a really good signing, a good physical 6, 7, 8 defenseman, and I think he should be able to work really well in Toronto. So a solid signing there, but that's the only signing we've had over the past couple of days. So we go over to the PTO update next. There's been a couple of PTO updates since we last talked. When we last talked, we had a couple more updates. Harrington signed a PTO in Anaheim. The Jackets signed 3 guys in Schnarr, Dell, and Milwaukee. 2 PTOs in Columbus. Peter Holland signed 1 in Colorado. We said Tampa signed 1 in with Watson. We said St. Louis signed 1 with Ratcliffe. So there was a lot of guys who signed PTOs, and there's been a couple more. So first with the Colorado Avalanche, they've signed another one. So to add to Peter Holland, who signed a PTO, they've now also added Yoel Kiviranta to the roster on a professional tryout. Kiviranta has been spending the past couple of seasons in Dallas. He was a really good bomb 6 forward. He just became a UFA this past year. So good to see that he's getting an opportunity to play in Colorado. I thought he would have been one of the UFAs who got signed up to this point, but he's going to have to go to the camp on a PTO and hopefully earn a contract from there. So not too surprised that Kiviranta needed a PTO. He's a good bomb 6 forward. I was surprised he didn't get an NHL contract and he needs to go to camp on a PTO. But still, he's a really good bomb 6 forward. He can produce well. He helped Dallas a couple of times. He's been a really serviceable bomb 6 forward. So if he can do well and show Colorado he's still that really good bomb 6 forward that can help in tough situations, I think he stands a good chance of getting a new contract with the Avalanche. So good to see him get a PTO, and hopefully he can continue to prove that he's still an NHL forward at this point in time. The Edmonton Oilers, we know they said they were going to sign Brandon Sutter. They officially signed Brandon Sutter to his PTO, so no surprise there. But another guy who they did sign would be Sam Gagner. Now, Gagner is originally a member of the Edmonton Oilers. He started out his career there. He was drafted in the 2007 season. He was drafted by the Edmonton Oilers, so he has a lot of familiarity with the organization. He spent his first 7 years in the Oilers organization. Since then, he's definitely bounced around a lot. Since the 13-14 season, he's gone to Arizona, he's gone to Philadelphia, Columbus, Vancouver. He went back to Edmonton, then he went to Detroit, then he went back to Edmonton again, then he went back to Detroit for a couple more seasons, and he spent last year with the Winnipeg Jets. He's been mostly, over the past couple of years, a solid bottom six forward, like a really good player who can play like fourth line minutes, 13th spare forward. So there's different spots for him. He's definitely not the player he used to be, a solid, good middle top six forward, but his role is definitely decreased. So I think there's just a good chance Gagne could get an NHL role with the Edmonton Oilers. I think there's also a good chance that if he doesn't get a contract with the Oilers, there's definitely a solid chance that he could get a contract elsewhere. I think he's still a really good, serviceable fourth line forward, possibly 13th, 14th forward for a team. So definitely, I think Gagne stands a good chance to at least get a contract with Edmonton, if not somewhere else. So a good PTO signing there for the Oilers, as I think that's a really good deal in my opinion. And hopefully one of Gagne or Suter can get a new contract with the Edmonton Oilers and prove that they're still good bottom six forwards. So hopefully for one of those two guys, they can get a new contract, or possibly even both. And the other PTO that happened is Cameron Hillis. Hillis was a previous prospect of the Montreal Canadiens and Chicago Blackhawks. He was drafted by the Montreal Canadiens. He was traded to Chicago in season last year, if I'm correct, at the beginning of the season, by the Montreal Canadiens to Chicago for defenseman Nicolas Baudon. And then he was let go by the Blackhawks. So wasn't qualified as an RFA, let go as a free agent. So he's going to get a shot with the Detroit Red Wings in their training camp. I don't expect Hillis to get a major opportunity to get the NHL level. He may be able to get a two-way NHL contract and be sent to the minors, but he spent some of these past couple of years in the ECHL too, so I don't expect there to be an overabundance of interest in Hillis. So we'll have to wait and see. I think he was a decent prospect. He definitely lost some of his value. He'd been playing over the ECHL a couple of years, so I don't expect Hillis to get too much of an opportunity in Detroit, but wouldn't be overly shocked if Hillis possibly got a two-way contract with some team. So going interested to see what he's going to be going to training camp with the Detroit Red Wings on a PTO. So Kiviranta in Colorado, Gagne in Edmonton, I think both stand good chances to, if not with the club they send their PTO with, then another team to get at least a two-way NHL contract to be a good bottom six or possibly spare NHL forward. Hillis, decent forward prospect. He's been in the game for a couple of years now, been playing over in the ECHL the past couple of years. I think there stands a good chance that he doesn't get an NHL contract like Kiviranta or Gagne, but I do think there's a good chance that he could get a new deal. So going interesting to see, but Hillis in Detroit, Kiviranta, and Gagne in Edmonton have all signed PTOs and will be heading to training camp with those teams. So going to be interesting to see which one of those three players can convert their PTOs into new two-way NHL contracts. Going over to Jason Demers, there's been a couple of reports I've recently seen that Jason Demers has basically retired. A lot of places I've seen this being mentioned, I've seen that it says Demers is basically almost finally retired. Hasn't become extremely official yet, but Demers is basically all but retired. So Jason Demers played last year in Edmonton, coming back after spending a year off. He's been a really good, serviceable top four defenseman over the past couple of years for a number of teams. His career started in 09-10 with the team who drafted him in the 7th round in the San Jose Sharks. He spent the first 5.5 seasons of his career with the San Jose Sharks, putting up some pretty decent point totals. His best was a 34-point season in the 13-14 season. Then he went to Dallas, spent a year there after the Sharks traded him midway through his 6th season there. He spent a year and a half with the Stars, did pretty good there, would then sign a 1-year deal in Florida, did pretty good there. Then he would remain in the Arizona Coyotes organization for 4 years, would take the 21-22 season off, didn't play in the NHL at that point. Then he signed with Edmonton late last season, got 1 game of NHL action in the Edmonton Oilers organization, and is now basically retired. So for the Demers, that's a really good career. He spent a lot of it in a lot of places. He didn't get into very many playoff games, as he's gone to a total of 61 playoff games over his career, putting up 3 goals, 13 assists, and with the teams he played with, he never got to a Stanley Cup final, so he doesn't go down with the Stanley Cup final, but he was a really good top 4 defenseman for the most part of his career, and was a really good defender back there for teams like the Sharks, Stars, Panthers, and Coyotes, as well as Oilers. So pretty good player there. sad to see him retire, but there's yet another player who's retired this offseason, that is Jason Demers. And on top of that, we also have another guy who retired recently, and that is Demers and Donskoi. Demers and Donskoi was actually a pretty good forward for a couple of teams. He was drafted in the 2010 draft by the Florida Panthers in the 4th round, which was not a bad place to be drafted, but he never played for Florida. The first few seasons of his career he spent in Liga. He actually didn't play his first NHL season until the 15-16 season, so he played over in Liga for quite some time. He was able to sign with the San Jose Sharks, and he actually did quite well during his time in San Jose. He spent 4 years from the 15-16 season to the 18-19 season in San Jose, would then spend 2 years with the Colorado Avalanche in their organization. Then he spent a year in Seattle playing with the Kraken. He went into last year with a concussion that put him on injury reserve, and that kept him out for the entirety of the season. Donskoi never played a game last year, and his contract expired at the end of this offseason, so he was a UFA, and now he's been retired. So not too good news for Donskoi, but I think with all the injuries he's gone through in his career, it's probably safe to say that this was a pretty likely scenario for him. Donskoi's been a decent forward, except for this first year in Seattle and his second year in San Jose. He's put up at least 30 points in each of his seasons at the NHL level. So given the fact he didn't make the NHL until 5 years after he was drafted, he actually worked out a really good career for himself. His best point total was in the 18-19 season, his last in San Jose, when he put up 14 goals, 23 assists, and 37 points. That was a really good season for him. His career point totals was 80 goals, 128 assists, 208 points for 474 games played. In the playoffs, he was actually a really good player. He was one of the San Jose Sharks' top point producers when they were making the playoffs, and they were doing well. His first year was actually when the Sharks went to the Stanley Cup Final. The Sharks had a couple of deep playoff runs. He also helped the Avs in the playoffs. He wound up finishing with 15 goals and 32 points in 69 playoff games. So he was a really good point producer in the playoffs. He did fantastic as a good middle six, bottom six forward at the NHL level, and it's good stat to see him go at such a young age. But Donskoi is now retired as well. He was a really good forward for the Sharks, Avs, and Kraken, and we wish him all the best with his retirement. So some pretty big retirements there. Both Donskoi and Demers have retired from the NHL. So going to be interesting to see what happens there. And lastly, here we're going to go over to some trade rumors that have happened recently. So first, I'm going to talk about the Dallas Stars. I've seen a couple of reports recently from a number of sources saying that the Dallas Stars may still want to improve their blue line before the season starts, and they may be looking to try and add a right-shot defenseman. Now, if you look at the Dallas Stars team, they have a decent defense, and a pretty good defense at that, but they didn't make much movement on the defensive end besides bringing in depth defensemen like bringing back Hanley and bringing in a guy like Bayreuther, who are both like 7th defensemen on that team. So not an overabundance of like solid NHL depth at that position, but they do have some pretty good players. They have guys like Miro Heiskanen, Esa Lindell, Ryan Suter. So that they definitely have some pretty good defenders, but most of those guys are playing on the left side, so there's a lot of speculation that they could try and bring in a guy on the right side. I mean, it's quite simply put that they could easily put a guy like Hakanpää or Lundqvist as a 7th defenseman on that team, and if they could find a way to make the money work, maybe bring in a right-shot defenseman to help, because Heiskanen can play right side if he needs to. You have Suter and Lindell who can be a good top 4 defenseman. You have Heiskanen. So maybe try and bring in another top 4 defenseman who can play on the right side, and then have guys like Hakanpää, Harley, Hanley, and Lundqvist sort of rotate on that third pair. But it's going to be interesting to see. But I wouldn't be too shocked if the Dallas Stars tried to improve that blue line. They've been linked to Noah Hanifin in the past. Hanifin's a left shot defenseman, so I expect it to be a little bit less likely. But Hanifin's a guy who's been linked to in the past. If they can move a guy like Mason Marchment, who would be making similar money to Hanifin, they could be able to bring in his contract. So even though it's not a right shot defenseman, I could definitely see them have some interest in him. A right shot defenseman who has been known to be possibly available for a trade would be a guy like Brett Pesce, a solid defensive defenseman, could really work well with a more offensive guy like Miro Heiskanen. So I think there's a possibility they could try and work out a trade to bring in Brett Pesce. There's also some other good right shot defensemen, some pretty good top 4 defensemen on the right side who are pending UFA guys who could be moved. Maybe not before the season, but maybe at some point before the deadline. It would be a guy like Chris Tanev in Calgary. I'm not sure if they're willing to move him at this point in time. He could be a guy of interest for Dallas. Tyson Barrie in Nashville, he could be a guy who has interest from the Dallas Stars. We know he could be moved at some point later in the season. If they get to the trade line, they're not doing overly well. Maybe a guy like Matt Dumba comes up. There's probably a couple of decent depth right shot defensemen that they could add who would be more third pair defensemen before the season starts. But I'd be looking at guys like Pesce and Hanifin as possible options if they're looking to try and add something before the start of the season. And if they're looking for in-season acquisitions, I could see guys like a Chris Tanev, Tyson Barrie, maybe Matt Dumba be possibly of interest to the Dallas Stars. So it's going to be interesting to see, but it sounds like the Stars are looking to add a right shot defenseman before the season starts, and it's going to be interesting to see if they wind up doing that. But they could definitely use a defensive upgrade, in my opinion. They have some decent defensive defensemen, but I'm not sure if they have 4 solid top 4 defensemen, so possibly adding another top 4 defenseman I think could be in the cards for the Dallas Stars before the season starts. Another recent report I saw an Edmonton article recently stating that the Edmonton Oilers could be possibly willing to trade top prospect Philip Broberg, could be available in season for the right price. Now, it's going to be interesting to see if the Oilers wind up moving him, but he's been a really good prospect ever since being drafted in the first round a couple of years ago. Broberg's a really, really good prospect, but a lot of people are saying with the left side of the fence so deep right now with the Edmonton Oilers, they have Brett Kulak as their third pair defenseman, and then they have Ekholm Nurse as their top 2 left shot defensemen. There's not a lot of options right now for Philip Broberg to make a way into the NHL roster. So there's a lot of talk that if they can get the right price at the trade line, possibly later in the season when they're trying to add, they could try and move Broberg for the right price. I think it would only be for the right price. I think it would have to be like either a decent middle 6 forward who's signed for a couple of years' time, or a decent like second, third pair defenseman who's signed for a couple of years' time, or they have to try and go after like a really good rental who's signed for the rest of this year, who's a pending UFA, who could help either in their top 6 or their top 4 on the defensive end. It's going to be interesting to see what happens because we don't really know what's going to happen with Edmonton. Like, they could get some injuries, some holes could open on that team, they could have a lot of options, and if they have some holes on that team, they have the cap space, maybe a guy like Broberg's moved to help fill in some of their holes. I think it's quite likely, a big possibility that Broberg could be moved. So it's going to be interesting to see. I'm not guaranteeing that Broberg's going to be traded. I think it'd be extremely likely to guarantee that he be dealt. But even though that's a possibility, I think Broberg's still a really good young prospect, and it would not surprise me at all if the Oilers were to be a little bit patient with this. But there's been a lot of recent reports saying that Broberg could be a trade chip at the deadline, and I think that's a possibility, given the fact Broberg hasn't been able to be established NHL defenseman up to this point, and they already have such a deep left side of the defense. I think it's quite possible that a guy like Broberg could be moved at some point in time. So it's going to be interesting to see, but I think it'd have to be the right price, like a really good middle 6 forward or second, third pair defenseman who's signed for a couple of years' time, or a solid top 4 defense or top 6 forward upgrade who is a rental, who they can really use for this upcoming season or possibly this season and beyond. So it's going to be interesting to see, but I would definitely think Broberg is going to be a trade chip at some point in time closer to the season. And if there's a right trade there for the Oilers that makes them a better team and closer to a cup contender for this upcoming season, I think they would be interested in moving Broberg. So it's going to be interesting to see. Another trade rumor I want to discuss here is, could the Columbus Blue Jackets be shopping Andrew Peeke? Now, there's been no rumors suggesting this, but there have been a couple of recent rumors suggesting that the Jackets could move Peeke in a possible trade to upgrade other positions of their team. Now, we know the Jackets have a really, really crowded blue line, but I've seen there's some linkage to Noah Hanifin in Columbus. A lot of people are saying a possible trade package would have to include Andrew Peeke. I've seen the Maple Leafs apparently have some interest possibly in Andrew Peeke. I've seen the Canucks a little while ago have some interest in Andrew Peeke. So I do wonder if the Jackets could be listening on a guy like Andrew Peeke, given the fact he's been linked to a couple of teams now. He's a good, in most scenarios, he's a good top 4, possibly top 6 right shot defenseman. He can play second, third pair minutes. He's a decent minute muncher. He did really well last year, even though Jackets are a really beat up blue line. He was able to get into a lot of games last year. He's not going to put up a ton of points, but he's a really good physical type second, third pair defenseman, and he can definitely eat up a lot of minutes. So I think there will be a lot of teams interested in Andrew Peeke. The one thing I do think is that the Jackets do have a very crowded blue line. Their top four, in my opinion, for next year will be Zach Werenski, new acquisition Demers and Donskoi, new acquisition Ivan Provorov, and youngster David Yurchuk. I think those are most likely the top four for this upcoming season. And then you have guys like Nick Blankenberg, Eric Branson, Andrew Peeke, Adam Boqvist, Jake Bean, who are all fighting for 2 spots on that team. So I think Blankenberg could be sent down given the fact that he's waiver exempt, even though I think he's a really good NHL defenseman. I think a Branson contract's really untradeable, so he's most likely going to be like a 7th, 6th defenseman on that team this year. And then you've got guys like Bean, Boqvist, and Peeke, who are all fighting for 2 spots. I don't think you want to move any one of those guys possibly on waivers, move them down. So I think there is a likely chance that one of those guys could get moved, and Peeke could definitely be the possible option. So definitely I think the right shot defenseman, Andrew Peeke, could definitely be moved for the right price. But it's going to be interesting to see. I think Peeke, for the right price, could definitely be moved by the Blue Jackets. So going to be interesting to see. I'm not exactly sure what the Jackets would want in a possible Andrew Peeke trade, but I think with their crowded blue line and the fact that Peeke seems to be getting a lot of interest from some teams around the NHL, I think there stands a good chance that Peeke could be dealt, if not before the season starts, maybe possibly in season for the Jackets if they were to try and upgrade their team in season. So going to be interesting to see, but Peeke I think is a name we have to watch out for over the next couple of weeks before the season starts. And lastly here, I want to touch on a possible trade between the Toronto Maple Leafs and Anaheim Ducks. Now, there's been a lot of speculation around this over the past couple of days. There's been a few reports suggesting this, but there's potentially a 5-player trade that could be discussed by the Toronto Maple Leafs and Anaheim Ducks to help the Maple Leafs free up some cap space. So the potential rumors as followed: the Toronto Maple Leafs trade TJ Brodie, Timothy Liljegren, and Nick Robertson to the Anaheim Ducks in exchange for Frank Vatrano and Urho Vainikainen. The trade would help the Leafs save enough cap space to become cap compliant, and would definitely help this team become a really good cap compliant team. Now the big question is, I don't think this trade makes a ton of sense for the Leafs. It makes a ton of sense for the Ducks, but not for the Leafs. The Leafs have 2 top 4 defensemen in Brodie and Liljegren. Even though Brodie did not do fantastic in the playoffs, he's still a solid top 4 defenseman, can play second pair minutes. He's a really good player. He eats up a lot of minutes. I don't think they want to be moving him if they don't have a significant improvement coming back. And Timothy Liljegren's really morphed into a really good top 4 defenseman, and I think the Leafs would rather keep him. So I don't think this trade works, given the fact they'd only be getting back Urho Vainikainen, who I think at this point in time is only a solid 3rd pair defenseman. So they'd be giving up 2 top 4 defensemen for a 3rd pair defenseman. Now, I think Vatrano could be a fantastic addition for the Leafs. They have a couple of decent top 9 forwards, but last year I remember the Maple Leafs being linked to a guy like Frank Vatrano, even though there was a lot of speculation that they couldn't really pull it off. So if they could get Vatrano to be a solid third line forward for the Leafs, it makes a ton of sense. But I just don't think getting Vatrano at the expense of 2 top 4 defensemen in Brodie and Liljegren would make a ton of sense for the Leafs. For the Ducks will make a ton of sense. I mean, you go from giving up Vainikainen to getting Liljegren, who's definitely a top 4 upgrade, and then you could have Brodie for the start of the season, and then trade him at the deadline, possibly 50% of his contract retained, for a decent return. Then you also get Nick Robertson, who could eventually be a solid top 9 forward for that team. So it definitely makes a ton of sense for the Ducks, but I don't see the real good possibility that the Leafs would be too interested in this trade. I mean, the Leafs, I think, could definitely be interested, but I don't expect them to have too much interest in doing the trade of this sorts. If they were to move Brodie, they would have to have a decent defenseman coming back to replace him, and I don't see the Ducks really making a move like that. Maybe they were able to move Brodie in a pick, maybe like Brodie in a 2nd round pick for a guy like Vatrano and Vainikainen. Maybe that's a little bit more reasonable, because Brodie does make a lot more money than Vatrano, so it does make a lot more sense to get Vatrano at that point in time. But the Leafs do still have a little bit of a weaker blue line, so if they're going to move Brodie, I think they have to move him for a cheaper top 4 defenseman who works well, or if they do move Brodie, then it has to be a subsequent move, possibly with a guy like William Nylander that can get them a defensive upgrade. So it's going to be interesting to see, but this is something I just wanted to discuss. That's all I'm going to talk about for today, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on all that was discussed here today. Do the Stars need a new defensive upgrade? Could they use a red shot defenseman before the season starts? Could the Jackets move Peeke before the season starts? Is Broberg a possible trade chip for the Oilers in season? And what do you think of this possible trade that sends Toronto, Vanakainen, and Vetrano from Anaheim in exchange for Brody, Liljegren, and Robertson? Personally, I don't think it works for the Maple Leafs, but I'd love to hear your guys' opinion. So definitely let me know down in the comments what you think. But that's all I'm going to talk about for today. Remember to like this video, and if you really liked it, remember to subscribe down below. I also do a blog talking about news, rumors, analysis, stuff like that, so definitely check that out. I'll leave a link to that in the description below. And I can't wait to see you guys all for the next video. See you guys soon.